The facility advertised itself as a tactical training center for civilians interested in emergency preparedness and self-defense skills. The website showed professional instructors teaching firearms handling, wilderness survival, first aid, and crisis response. Testimonials praised the quality of instruction and the community atmosphere. Photos depicted participants engaged in legitimate training activities on a rural property with shooting ranges and obstacle courses. Local residents knew the facility as a fixture in the county for over a decade. The property employed local contractors for maintenance, purchased supplies from area businesses, and occasionally hosted charity events that raised money for veterans organizations. The owner appeared at town council meetings, spoke respectfully about Second Amendment rights, and emphasized the center's commitment to legal, responsible firearms training. Everything suggested a lawful business catering to Americans' constitutional rights and interest in preparedness. But in a gun shop 300 miles away, an owner noticed something that troubled him. A customer had come in asking about bulk ammunition purchases. Large quantities of rifle rounds, specific calibers, enough to supply a small military unit. The customer said it was for a training facility, that they went through ammunition quickly with multiple classes per week. Nothing illegal about bulk purchases. Many legitimate ranges and training centers bought ammunition in similar quantities. But the customer had also asked detailed questions about armor-piercing rounds and about legal restrictions on purchasing explosives components. The gun shop owner, a veteran who had served in law enforcement before opening his business, recognized the questions as beyond normal training needs. He declined the explosives inquiry and sold only standard ammunition. After the customer left, the shop owner reviewed his store's surveillance footage. He took note of the vehicle, the license plate, and the training center name mentioned during the transaction. Then he called the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. ATF agents ran the license plate. The vehicle was registered to an individual with a previous arrest for threatening a federal employee, though charges had been dropped due to insufficient evidence. The individual was listed as head instructor at the Tactical Training Center. ATF forwarded the information to the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Operations Unit. The Bureau maintained databases of individuals and organizations associated with extremist movements. The Tactical Training Center appeared in multiple entries, flagged by different field offices across several years. An analyst compiled the references. Someone matching the head instructor's description had attended anti-government rallies in 3 states. The facility's owner had posted on social media forums known for hosting extremist rhetoric. Several individuals who had trained at the facility had later been arrested for weapons violations or threatening government officials. The patterns didn't prove criminal activity, but they suggested the training center warranted closer examination. FBI agents conducted background research on the facility's key personnel. The owner had military experience, honorably discharged after 8 years of service. But after leaving the military, he had become increasingly involved in anti-government movements. He spoke at events organized by militia groups, contributed to websites promoting conspiracy theories about federal tyranny, and advocated for armed resistance to what he called constitutional violations. The head instructor had an extensive criminal history: assault charges, weapons violations, threatening communications. Most charges had resulted in minimal sentences or probation, but the pattern showed escalating hostility toward government authority and willingness to use violence. The FBI obtained authorization to monitor the facility's communications and observe its activities. Surveillance teams established observation posts on public land surrounding the property. Technical specialists intercepted electronic communications with proper judicial warrants. Undercover operatives inquired about enrollment in training courses. The surveillance revealed activity inconsistent with the standard firearms training operation. Participants arrived in groups, often traveling from distant states. They brought extensive personal equipment, including tactical gear, communications devices, and military-grade firearms. Training exercises resembled military combat drills rather than civilian firearms instruction. Intercepted communications used coded language but referenced preparing for imminent conflict with federal government. Participants discussed operational plans, target selection, and coordination across multiple states. The rhetoric wasn't abstract political discussion, but concrete planning for violent action. FBI analysts cross-referenced individuals observed at the facility against known extremist networks. They identified members of at least 7 different militia groups from 6 states. Some were leaders of their local organizations. Others were recruiters responsible for expanding membership. The Tactical Training Center functioned as a coordination point where geographically separated groups could meet, train together, and plan unified operations. The investigation escalated when surveillance teams observed weapons modifications being performed at the facility. Participants were altering rifles to increase rate of fire, converting weapons to configurations that skirted legal restrictions, and fabricating suppressors that would make weapons harder to detect when fired. The modifications violated federal firearms laws. But more concerning was what they suggested about intent. The weapons being modified weren't designed for sport shooting or even standard self-defense. They were being configured for combat operations against human targets. The FBI deployed additional surveillance resources. Aircraft equipped with thermal imaging documented nighttime training exercises. Ground teams photographed participants and recorded vehicle information. Technical specialists analyzed electronic signals to map the facility's communications network and identify external contacts. The electronic surveillance uncovered communications with sympathizers embedded in law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Not operational members of the extremist network, but individuals who provided warnings about investigations, shared law enforcement intelligence, and offered tactical advice. The penetration of law enforcement created operational security challenges for the FBI investigation itself. Investigators discovered the facility was training participants in counter-surveillance techniques, operational security, and tactics designed specifically to evade law enforcement. Instructors taught how to recognize FBI surveillance, how to communicate without electronic monitoring, and how to operate in cells that could maintain activity even if leadership was arrested. The training revealed an organization preparing not just for spontaneous violence, but for sustained operational capability against law enforcement and government targets. The FBI obtained search warrants based on the weapon's modification evidence. But before executing the warrants, investigators wanted to fully map the network's extent. If they raided only the training facility, they would capture some participants but miss the broader organization. They needed to identify all affiliated cells, all weapons caches, all individuals involved in planning operations. The Bureau established a joint task force with ATF, state police agencies, and local law enforcement carefully vetted to exclude anyone with potential extremist sympathies. The task force analyzed years of facility records, tracked participants back to their home states, and identified associated properties where weapons or explosives might be stored. Financial analysis revealed the facility was funded through a network of small donations from hundreds of supporters. The funding structure made it difficult to trace money to illegal activities. but it demonstrated the organization had substantial grassroots support across multiple states. More troubling was evidence that the organization was actively recruiting military personnel and veterans. The facility offered free training to anyone with military service, specifically targeting individuals with specialized skills in explosives, communications, or tactical operations. At least 23 active duty service members from different military installations had attended training at the facility within the past 2 years. The FBI coordinated with military criminal investigators to identify the service members and assess whether they were innocently attending firearms training or actively participating in an extremist organization. The assessment was complicated. Attending a firearms training course wasn't illegal for military personnel, but if they were participating in planning operations against the government they were sworn to defend, they were committing serious crimes. Investigators interviewed several service members under the pretext of routine security clearance updates. Most claimed they had attended the facility only for civilian firearms training, that they hadn't participated in extremist discussions, that they hadn't known about the organization's anti-government planning. But a few interviews revealed more concerning information. One service member described the facility as preparing for what instructors called restoration of constitutional government. Another mentioned discussions of identifying government facilities that would need to be secured in the event of constitutional crisis. A third acknowledged that some participants openly discussed preparing for armed conflict with federal authorities. The FBI built profiles on the organization's leadership. The facility owner was the ideological leader, articulating the philosophical justification for armed resistance to government tyranny. The head instructor was the operational commander, responsible for tactical training and operational planning. Below them were regional coordinators who managed affiliated militia groups in different states. The organization's structure followed classic insurgency models. Small cells operating independently, but coordinated through central leadership. Compartmentalized communications, so members knew only what they needed for their specific roles. Redundant leadership, so operations could continue even if key individuals were arrested. Intercepted communications revealed the organization was planning specific operations. Discussions referenced potential targets including federal buildings, infrastructure, and law enforcement facilities. The planning remained somewhat abstract, with leaders emphasizing that action would only be taken in response to specific triggering events. But the preparations were concrete and ongoing. The FBI discovered the organization had established weapons caches in 7 states. Hidden on private property or public land, the caches contained rifles, ammunition, explosives components, and tactical equipment. The caches were positioned to support operations without requiring transportation of weapons across state lines, making federal interdiction more difficult. Surveillance teams located 3 of the caches through extended observation of participants traveling from the training facility to remote locations. Each cache was documented but not seized immediately. The FBI wanted to identify all caches and arrest all participants simultaneously to prevent the organization from going underground with weapons still distributed across multiple states. The investigation reached a critical point when intercepted communications suggested the organization was preparing to transition from training to operations. Leaders discussed recent political developments as potential triggers for action. They emphasized the need for participants to be ready to mobilize on short notice. They referenced timelines measured in weeks rather than months or years. The FBI couldn't wait longer without risking that the organization would initiate violent operations. federal prosecutors authorized arrests and search warrants. The operation was planned to execute simultaneously across 7 states, targeting the training facility, affiliated properties, weapons caches, and residences of key participants. More than 600 federal agents and local law enforcement officers were mobilized. The operation required coordination across multiple FBI field offices, ATF regional offices, and state police agencies. Briefings emphasized the high-risk nature of the targets, who were heavily armed, trained in tactical operations, and ideologically committed to resisting law enforcement. The operation launched at dawn on a Friday. FBI tactical teams approached the training facility from multiple directions. Aerial surveillance confirmed the presence of approximately 30 individuals on the property. Negotiators broadcast messages instructing everyone to exit buildings with hands visible and surrender peacefully. The facility owner initially refused, broadcasting his own message claiming the FBI had no authority on his property and that he would defend his constitutional rights. For 40 minutes, negotiators worked to convince him that resistance would result in bloodshed, and that he could challenge the government legally rather than violently. Eventually, he surrendered. Participants exited buildings one by one, hands raised, and were taken into custody without violence. FBI agents secured the property and began processing evidence. Simultaneously, across 6 other states, federal agents raided affiliated properties and residences. Most arrests occurred without incident. A few individuals barricaded themselves temporarily, but surrendered when tactical teams deployed. Only one location resulted in shots fired when an individual pointed a weapon at agents. The individual was wounded and taken into custody. No agents were injured. The weapons and evidence seized were staggering. Over 400 firearms, including fully automatic weapons modified illegally, thousands of rounds of ammunition, explosives components that could produce dozens of improvised devices, tactical gear including body armor, night vision equipment, and communication systems, documents detailing potential targets and operational plans. Federal prosecutors unsealed indictments charging 53 individuals with conspiracy to violate civil rights through force, conspiracy to damage government property, illegal weapons modifications, and possession of explosives components. The lead organizers faced additional charges including seditious conspiracy and providing material support for terrorism. The Justice Department held a press conference describing the investigation and arrests. The Attorney General emphasized that the government respected Second Amendment rights and legitimate firearms training, but that this organization had crossed from legal activity into criminal conspiracy to commit violence against government institutions and personnel. The indictments detailed extensive evidence, intercepted communications discussing operational plans, photographs of illegal weapons modifications, testimony from undercover agents who had attended training courses, financial records showing funding networks, documents found during searches outlining target selection and attack methodologies. The arrests triggered responses from various political perspectives. Some praised the FBI for preventing potential terrorist attacks. Others questioned whether the government was criminalizing political speech and Second Amendment activities. The debate reflected broader tensions about where the line falls between protected political expression and criminal conspiracy. The trials began 18 months after the arrests. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of criminal planning that went far beyond political rhetoric. The defense attempted to argue that discussions of resistance to tyranny were protected speech, that weapons modifications were technical violations at most, and that no actual attacks had occurred. But the evidence showed concrete preparation for violence. Weapons caches positioned for operational use. Training focused specifically on attacking government facilities. Communications discussing timelines and triggers for initiating attacks. The organization hadn't merely discussed abstract political theory. They had built operational capability to execute violent operations. The jury convicted the facility owner and head instructor on all major charges. They received sentences of 35 and 40 years respectively. Regional coordinators received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. Participants who had undergone training but weren't involved in operational planning received lighter sentences of 5 to 12 years. The convictions prompted congressional hearings on domestic extremism and how law enforcement should respond. The hearings explored difficult questions about distinguishing between protected political activity and criminal conspiracy, about monitoring domestic groups without violating civil liberties, and about addressing the underlying factors that drove individuals toward extremist violence. The FBI issued new guidelines for investigating domestic extremism. The guidelines emphasize that investigations must be based on criminal activity or credible evidence of planned violence, not on political ideology or constitutionally protected speech. They required enhanced oversight for investigations of groups engaged in political activity to prevent abuse of investigative powers. But the guidelines also recognized that domestic extremist violence posed a serious threat requiring proactive investigation. The challenge was conducting effective investigations while respecting civil liberties, distinguishing criminal conspiracies from protected political dissent, and preventing violence without creating perception of political persecution. The training facility's property was sold at auction. The proceeds went to victim compensation funds for individuals threatened or harmed by participants in the extremist network. The buildings were demolished. The land remained vacant, a rural property with no indication of what had existed there. But the ideology that had motivated the organization persisted. Other groups with similar beliefs continued operating in various states. Some learned from the arrested organization's operational security failures and became harder to detect. Others moderated their public rhetoric while maintaining extremist beliefs privately. The FBI maintained active investigations into dozens of domestic extremist organizations across the political spectrum. The work required constant balance between protecting public safety and preserving civil liberties, between investigating genuine threats and avoiding politically motivated targeting. 5 years after the arrests, the FBI published a comprehensive threat assessment on domestic violent extremism. The assessment concluded that the threat remained serious and evolving. Extremist groups were becoming more sophisticated in operational security, more selective in recruitment, and more capable of inspiring violence without direct organizational direction. The Tactical Training Center case became a study in how extremist organizations operate in plain sight, how they exploit legitimate activities as cover for illegal operations, how they build networks across state lines that complicate law enforcement jurisdiction, how they prepare for violence while maintaining plausible deniability until the moment they attack. The lesson was that preventing domestic terrorism requires vigilant investigation, balanced with respect for constitutional rights, requires distinguishing between protected political speech and criminal conspiracy, requires early intervention before preparations turn into attacks, and sometimes requires that a gun shop owner recognizes something wrong in a customer's questions and makes the call that starts an investigation.